In his day, his presence was felt in every corner of the Soviet Union. But was there a single person in that huge country who could say he really knew him? They all held their breath as they waited to catch sight of him, and when he entered, they rose as one man to greet him. But woe betide the first one to stop applauding. Winston Churchill called him an enigma wrapped in a mystery, and time has not cleared the mystery. Joseph Stalin rewrote his history to suit himself. His death did not remove the system he created. Stalin's heirs live in his shadow, and Stalin's power remains in their hands.
Партизаны и партизанки, на вас смотрит весь мир, как на силу способную уничтожить разбойничьи орды немыслимых захватчиков.
As it has come down to us from his public appearances, Stalin's portrait is distant and unreal. Adolf Hitler's voice alone could persuade millions of Germans to follow his lead. In Winston Churchill, the British saw the embodiment of the spirit and traditions of their island race.
The beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
But what was the secret of this man's power? Harrison E. Salisbury of the New York Times observed Stalin at close quarters on many occasions.
I define power as the ability to change and control events, to change and control people, and that includes changing people from living to dead. Stalin had that power. He organized it from the inside, and once he had the power, he organized a charismatic image of himself and exercised the power under the banner of that image.
Whenever we are allowed to look at Stalin, we have to ask ourselves what purpose the image was intended to serve. A man to love or a man to fear? An outstanding leader or just one of the people? Stalin used the newsreels to paint whatever portrait of himself suited his purpose at the time. But who was it that lived behind the image? He was actually a small man, not more than 5'6" in height. But to disguise his short stature, he surrounded himself with men as small as himself. A taller man would not survive long in his presence. Nor was he physically imposing, his left hand being slightly crippled from a boyhood injury. His piercing eyes were what visitors found most disconcerting. Not to return Stalin's gaze steadily could be a man's undoing. Stalin grew up in the Russia of the Tsars, a Russia which was one of the great imperial powers of Europe. Though she possessed enormous natural resources, she was not an industrial nation. Her power was symbolized by the reverence and glittering ceremony which surrounded her ruler, and the dignitaries of a church whose traditions went back to the creation of the Slavic state. Stalin himself came from Georgia. His parents were peasants who had earlier been liberated from the condition of agricultural slavery known as serfdom. It was because Russia was still a largely agrarian country with hardly any urban proletariat, that Karl Marx declared her to be an unhistorical nation outside the scope of his Workers' Manifesto. This was the only world that Stalin knew, a Russia of dynastic power upheld by secret police and a state religion. Stalin the Georgian would become more Russian than the Russians, more autocratic than the Tsar.
He was strongly influenced by his mother's image of what she wanted him to be. She wanted him to be, of course, a priest. His mother always thought that he'd failed because he'd become a dictator instead of a high man of the church.
By 1917, when the old order inside Russia gave way under the terrible blows suffered in the war with Germany, Stalin had already been in trouble with the authorities and spent time in Siberia. He had learned his lessons in secrecy, deceit, and double dealing, and ostensibly he was a rebel against the powers that be.
I consider that in 1917 there was only one genuine revolution, that of February, not the one in November. The February Revolution was made by the people of Russia in the streets, principally the housewives, the poor people who had been standing for months, for weeks, for days, in lines for food, for bread, for kerosene. And day after day, when they went into those lines with the temperatures 30 below zero, they'd come up to the door of the store, it would be closed, and there'd be a sign there saying, "Hleba niet, kerosene niet." They were out of supplies, there was nothing to eat, and it was cold, and there was nothing to heat their houses with. The police standing beside those lines sympathized with the housewives, and all of a sudden it boiled over in anger. And in a matter of days, the Tsarist regime had been overthrown, not by revolutionaries, but ordinary people who didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know they were making revolution, they just knew they were fed up with what was going on.
One man at least was determined to profit by the chaos of 1917. No one was more surprised than Lenin when troubles broke out in Russia. Hurrying back from Switzerland under German protection, Lenin engineered the October coup d'etat and seized power in Moscow with his small group of followers known as Bolsheviks. Stalin belonged to this group, although with his rough provincial manner, he had little in common with the intellectuals of the movement who had enjoyed exile in the capitals of Europe. Recognizing that the center of power lay in Lenin's person, Stalin stuck closely to Lenin, at least in the record he subsequently had made. The 38-year-old Georgian knew how to look after himself in the struggle for survival.
He was a back office man. He was a manipulator. He was a remarkable bureaucrat. He knew how to organize the inside workings of the party at a time when the real revolutionary members of the party were all out in the streets fighting. He was looking over the files, the card indexes, making appointments. At this, he was an organization man. We see him in large bureaucratic organizations today. We see them in the great corporations. We see them in the great bureaucracies of government. The little men no one knows, but all of a sudden it turns out that they're the one who have the real power because they have made the key appointments over a period of years and they have the solid organization. This was Stalin's great genius and talent.
While Stalin worked his way up through the party office, a more spectacular contender for power was Trotsky, organizer of the Red Army. Trotsky acted his part on the open stage, a lover of the limelight, who welcomed outsiders with their newsreel cameras since he sought an international role for himself. For Trotsky, backward Russia was only a launching pad for world power. The chaos of 1917 was followed by armed intervention by France and Britain and then by civil war. Anarchy reigned throughout Russia, and all human values were abandoned. In this struggle for power in its most brutal form, Trotsky and the Red Army, behaving as savagely as everyone else, eventually won the day. But when it was over, no one could disentangle truth from falsehood, rights from wrongs. It had been every man for himself, a game Stalin knew only too well how to play. Realizing that performances which were staged for the newsreels could just as easily be restaged according to the requirements of the day, Stalin later authorized the making of a dramatized documentary of these years.
Расстрелян. Точка. Противник продвигается глубже, угрожая линии Царицын-Сарет. Что случилось?
In this extract, Stalin, played by an actor, receives a message from Trotsky ordering him to retreat. Stalin disregards the order and organizes a bold attack instead.
Until you have the power, you cannot use the media to enhance your power by building yourself up in the particular image which you've selected for use at that particular time. First you get a hold of that power and then you use it. Now it is also true that you can use the media to some extent before you have total power, but it's quite difficult even in a dictatorial situation because the contenders for the leadership are always very jealous and they watch the pictures and the images very closely.
In this version, Stalin is on the battlefield in person, oblivious of danger, to watch his men drive the White Army from their positions. The writing of history, after all, is the prerogative of the victor, and the millions of Russians who died in and after the Bolshevik takeover in 1917 had, until recently at least, no one to act for them. Dead men tell no tales. A Stalin, a Trotsky, a Lenin, they all knew that. Russians like simple proverbs. Lenin, in fact, was the first to die in 1924 after a series of strokes which incapacitated him during the critical period when Russia was in chaos and the Bolsheviks were maneuvering among themselves for the succession. At Lenin's funeral, Stalin was one of the pallbearers and delivered a eulogy over the body. Towards the end of his life, Lenin had dictated his last testament to his party, in which he recommended that Stalin should be moved from his office of General Secretary. It was not that Stalin had too much power, but that he might not use this power with a sufficient caution. Stalin's main fault in Lenin's eyes consisted in rudeness. It was a fault Lenin considered fully tolerable among party members, but not in the General Secretary's office. Stalin, however, succeeded in keeping knowledge of Lenin's criticism from all but the inner core of party members. If rudeness was all Lenin objected to in Stalin, the dead leader could only have applauded the manner in which Stalin set the record straight in his celluloid version of their relationship. In this feature film, the two leaders are portrayed as amiable comrades.
Stalin, дорогой мой. Здравствуй, голубчик. Надя! Сталин приехал!
Нади нет, она ушла на работу.
Ах, на работу ушла. Ну, здравствуй, родной мой. Садитесь, пожалуйста. Садитесь, садитесь. Я устал здесь сидеть.
The ailing Lenin advised Stalin to be merciless in his proletarian ardor. Party loyalty, everyone agreed, was the paramount virtue among comrades. New myths are born of the old. To preserve Lenin's place in history, Stalin himself would one day have to be de-Stalinized. But in those critical months following Lenin's death, the party could not afford to lose its general secretary. Stalin bided his time.
In the period after Lenin's death, Stalin did not emerge suddenly in the public mind as an important figure. He first consolidated his position within the organization, and once he'd gotten that and gotten all his rivals out of the way, then he constructed a public figure.
Stalin resented the internationalist views of other Soviet leaders. He was especially suspicious of Trotsky, a latecomer to the Bolshevik cause and a Jew. Trotsky's brilliant organization of the Red Army gave him a power base outside the party organization. Playing upon his colleagues' jealousies of Trotsky, Stalin succeeded in driving him into exile. Stalin's position as general secretary of the party enabled him to build up a network of supporters personally loyal to himself and to undermine anyone who sought to create a rival power base. Russia in the 1920s was in a desperate plight. The war and its aftermath had devastated the country and undone the slow but steady advance of the national economy, which had been evident at the beginning of the century. She needed time to repair the damage. But Stalin could not afford to wait. His first priority was to oust the remaining leaders of the old Bolshevik group. To this end, he advocated the enforced collectivization of agriculture, followed by a massive program of rapid industrialization, policies which outmaneuvered first one set of rivals, then another. The results caused the most appalling suffering throughout Russia. Stalin cared nothing for the cost in human terms. A celluloid version of success could always be shown to visitors and then placed in the archives. Naturally, there were no newsreels around to show the widespread famine and misery which followed the uprooting of tens of millions of peasants from their traditional way of life. Stalin used brute force to build what he called socialism in one country. Rudeness, intimidation, intolerance, cunning, deceit. These were the methods by which he had achieved power, and his henchmen used the same methods. Failures were blamed on others. Engineers and foreign specialists were liable to be arrested and charged with sabotage. Anyone who stepped out of line was shot. Stalin's justification for his actions was that Russia's backwardness had left her 100 years behind the other powers in the world. A 10-year effort, he argued, would enable Russia to catch up and take her rightful place among them. Without such an effort, she would forever be at their mercy. The damage Stalin inflicted to Russian agriculture has never been fully made good. Outsiders may have been taken in by the show places they were allowed to visit, but the true picture of conditions inside Russia surpassed in horror anything Europe has known in the 20th century. The system of secret police and labor camps which Lenin initiated was swollen to grotesque proportions to deal with the millions of men and women from all parts of the Soviet Union who at one time or another were declared to be enemies of the state. It is possible that as many as 2 million lives were lost each year in Stalin's slave labor brigades. The modern Soviet state is built on their graves. Stalin's principal concern was for himself only. Displaying a paranoid suspicion of all around him, he embarked on a series of show trials in which one group of potential opponents after another were forced to confess to crimes against the party. Purges continued throughout the 30s. Thousands upon thousands from all walks of life were sent to their deaths, including the entire staff of the Red Army and all the old Bolshevik leaders. The object was to glorify Stalin himself as the sole repository of party orthodoxy. Stalin, in effect, became Lenin, or as he liked it to be put, Stalin is Lenin in our day.
Stalin's trial Against me is built upon false confessions extorted by modern inquisitorial method in the interest of the ruling clique.
Banished from Russia, Trotsky still had access to the newsreels.
For execution than the Moscow trials of Zinoviev Kamenev and Radek Petakov. These trials developed not from communism, not from socialism, but from Stalinism. That is, from the irresponsible despotism of the bureaucracy over the people. What is now my principal task? To reveal the truth, to show and to demonstrate that the true criminals hide under the cloak of the accusers. I have nothing to hide. Dozens of witnesses who are abroad possess invaluable facts and documents which will shed light on the Moscow frame-ups. The work of the Commission of Inquiry must terminate in a agreed counter-process, counter-trial. A counter-trial is necessary to cleanse the atmosphere of the germs of deceit, calumny, falsification, and frame-ups whose source is Stalin's police, the GPU, which has fallen to the level of the Nazi Gestapo.
In 1940, an assassin caught up with Trotsky in Mexico. In his days in power, Trotsky had not shown any squeamishness over the use of terror. The revolution had now devoured all its children, all but one.
Stalin has now completed his power in Russia. It's a total power. He has no enemies. He's eliminated them all. He's in control of every apparatus of the government. It looks as though there's nothing but clear sailing ahead. But what he does not know and what the world does not know is that while he has made it at home, the enemies still lurk abroad. He does not understand the international situation, and out of that complex decade leading up to World War II are going to be challenges which will almost overthrow this all-powerful dictator.